Hi, in this video I'd like to show you how to increase by knitting into the front and the back of a stitch. I've got an example here of knitting into the front and the back in stockinette, 2 stitches in from the edge. So here's our edge stitch. The second stitch has an increase into the back of the second stitch. Across the row you can see where I've got the edge stitch, 1 single stitch, and then the increase was done by the 3rd stitch in from the end right there. And here's another example here and here. And you can see how they show up as purl bumps, what looks like purl bumps on the front of the fabric. Next, here is what looks like knit 2, purl 2 ribbing, and I've got increases in this as well. So I've got my edge stitch right here, and then I've knit into the front and the back of the second stitch, and you can see the increase right here. Working across the row, I've got my last stitches in the row here. I've got the knit stitch, which has a knit front and back right on top of it right there. You can see that. But it's disguised in the knit 2, purl 2 rib. So it becomes knit 2, purl 3 rib. In the last portion of this example, I've increased knit front and back in garter stitch. So you can see here, 2 stitches in from the edge. There's my edge stitch. The second stitch has a stitch that's knit into the front and back. Front and back. Across the row, the same thing here. We've got our last stitches. Here's our last knit stitch with a piggyback stitch, knit front and back, and then the last 2 stitches of the row. You can see how well that's disguised in garter stitch. So we've got knit front and back in stockinette, in ribbing, and in garter. This is fun. Now I'm going to show you how to do that. So I've got a sample here, and I'll just show you how to knit into the front and back of a stitch. So I knit into a single stitch on the edge, and I'm going to increase on the second stitch. So I knit into the front of the stitch until I'm ready to remove that stitch from the needle. I don't remove it from the needle, however. I stretch this first part of it out and roll over the top and knit into the back of that same stitch. Now, because I've stretched out the previous stitch, I'm going to just give a little tug before I wrap it and pull the stitch through that small opening created by going into the back of the stitch. Okay, let's do that again. So this stitch, I'm going to knit into the front and the back of this stitch, making 1 stitch into 2. Into the front, wrap like I'm knitting, pull it through the stitch without taking it off, roll to the back, knit into the back strand of that same stitch, a little tug on the yarn, wrap the stitch, pull it through there, and you've made 2 stitches. So you can see where we've got a knit stitch and a second stitch right after it that looks a little bit like a purl stitch, but these are all created by knitting. All right, let's do it one more time. Knit in the front of the stitch, wrap like you're knitting, pull the stitch through like you normally would for a knit stitch. I like to elongate that stitch a little bit just to make it easier to dive into the back of that same stitch. Wrap like you're knitting, pull that stitch through the same stitch again. So there you have it. Knit front and back. It's a good all-purpose increase, especially in